Welcome to Harris Hall, home of the History Department. I'm Robin Bates, and I'm talking to one of my newest colleagues, Zavier Nunn. Professor Nunn is someone who's a scholar of sexual difference and sexual classification, people who have had these classifications imposed on them. And his research really focuses on Weimar and Nazi Germany in the mid 20th century, and inviting us really to reconsider the periodization of those two eras. So, welcome, Zanya.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks.
How you doing?
I'm good. I'm great. How are you doing?
Doing great. You come to us from Duke and from Columbia and from the University of Oxford. And so I want to sort of ask you to talk a bit about your trajectory as a historian. Was this like a lifelong dream? Was it something that you stumbled into?
It's a great question. I think it goes back a bit further than those institutional affiliations that I have. I'm from the UK, and in the UK, like a lot of us have to make these decisions a little early on. So it's not that I always had, I wasn't a 6-year-old and someone said to me, like, what do you want to be when you're older? And I was like, a professional historian. That's not the fairy tale story that I can give, but I did have to make decisions in my A levels, or like which A levels I would take very early on, where we narrowed down to like 3 or 4 topics, and one of those topics was history. And I was very lucky. I went to a Rudolf Steiner school or a Waldorf school. I think we have some of those in America. And they're very, very strong in the humanities and the arts and the languages. And I always like oriented towards those topics. And so when I was deciding to go to college, we don't, in the UK, we come in and we apply for the discipline that we're going to do. So you don't come in and do a major or
Hmm.
minor. You come in just straight doing the topic. And so already I'd narrowed down to basically like history of art, English lit, German. Those were the things I'd been doing in high school or like the equivalent in the UK. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to go to college. What am I going to do? And for me, it was like history was the sweet spot. It meant that I didn't have to give up any of those other interests. I was like, well, with history, I can take any lens onto the past. I can still do art and culture, which is what I was doing in art history. I can do politics. I can do basically anything that I want. It's like the perfect buffet of doing the humanities. And it was also, and I think this is different in the US, but for me, it was like I also get to do whatever I want afterwards.
Yeah.
A lot of people that do a history degree in the UK, they'll go on to do law, they'll do journalism, they'll work in politics, and sometimes you take other kind of trajectories. But it meant that I kind of was like, everything is open to me. And I get to just do the really nerdy thing and just like learn about the past. And when I was at school, it was like, I think part of it, I mean, I'm sure we all have stories like this, but it was partly because of one teacher that I had. I had a history teacher called Mr. Mike. We called him Mr. Mike because he was Greek and his last name was Hadjipaterius, and they seemed to think that we wouldn't be able to say this name, which is
Which you clearly can.
which we clearly could. It was a little infantilizing, but whatever. We move. Um, and he was great. He'd like done a degree in history at the University of Reading and then gone on to teach and stuff. But he was also an actor. And so I think one of the reasons I'm a historian is because I had a teacher that would literally like jump up on a desk when we were doing the French Revolution and be like, I am Robespierre, and like really have at it. And
Have you
I,
done this in the classroom?
no, no, I don't. I haven't yet found my inner Mr. Mike to to like give that kind of projected lived history. Maybe I should try. I think it's a little harder because I do certain heavy topics like doing the Nazi period is a little bit more questionable. Although with the French Revolution also has some of those connotations. So yeah, I think just like a combination of being always enamored with history, but also kind of thinking like this doesn't narrow down any of the possibilities of learning or like what I will do afterwards. And then when I went to grad school, um, at that point, people do leave the academy and do different things. But for me, it was like a choice primarily that came out of being like, I'm not happy doing other things. And I found a groove here and I'm very, very satisfied with it. And then I was incredibly lucky that I got to experience, like the history department at Oxford and like move to these different institutions and sort of balance my two interests, which is history, but also gender and sexuality studies, so it's more theoretical kind of angle and like really bring them together.
And
Um,
I should say for those watching the video that you're cross-appointed in history and in GSS.
right, exactly. Yeah. And that also is like a dream appointment for me. I have 3 degrees in history, and I see myself very much as almost like a classic historian. I work primarily with like state archives, led medical, legal kind of source material, but that having that other cap, like that other way of thinking that's more abstract and theoretical, and then applying it to the sort of like the source material, that has been just tremendous. And like I've just felt really lucky that I've been able to move around and be in conversation with so many different people at these amazing institutions.
You've mentioned your research. You have some just amazing archives that you've uncovered. You're writing a book, I understand, on 6 trans women in Weimar and Nazi Germany. For some of us who are not as versed as you, it is a surprise that there are such archives to be found.
Yeah.
I kind of learned that from your work. And I just wonder if you could put us in the picture of how you ended up finding these stories.
Yeah, of course, yeah. For those who maybe don't know, I can try and like really
Yeah.
quickly kind of summarize like what's going on in this period. So, Weimar Republic, Germany's first republic democracy, also had a very vibrant, live queer and trans community. This was kind of enabled by like the removal of censorship laws and the ability for certain communities to like have a really robust cultural life, nightlife, all these different things. Think of cabaret, stuff like
Yeah.
that. Um, in the less cultural, more formal institutional sphere, there was something called the Institute for Sexual Science that was established in Berlin in 1919. And this was a clinic that sort of served all sexual matters and needs. So this included like stuff that we now see as like STI education or like marriage counseling, so sort of generic sexual health issues, but it also provided a space for transvestites or people we might call trans today because the way that people understood themselves and what they could do in terms of like living in the sex or gender they weren't assigned at birth was made possible partly through this institute. And so a lot of the kind of source material that one would look for was attached to this institute. It was destroyed on May 6th, 1933. So, mere months after the Nazis came into power. And for a lot of people that were doing this research before I decided to do it, for my PhD, people were kind of assumptive that there wouldn't be anywhere to kind of find the material that you needed to write a history
Mhm.
about trans people about. And then when I set out to do this, one of my advisors, Nick Stargart at Oxford, he was like, you might have to make peace with the fact that you want a gold dust source and you will not find it. And so I was like, okay, cool, no worries. And I kind of said about it in a really practical way. And I just kind of said, look, we know that there were trans people who could change their first name and their sex marker. And these are things that are administered by the state. These
Mhm.
aren't things that just happen in a kind of like a semi-private localized institute. So there have to be state records. Even if that institute was destroyed, I can just basically go old school route, go into the state archive and find those sources. So that was one kind of avenue. The other avenue, which I think historians of sexuality often take, was I kind of was like, what are the gendered sexual acts that were penalized?
Mhm.
And just going into the state archive and looking at those paragraphs that penalize sodomy, that penalize cross-dressing,
Mhm.
and finding stories through that route, which obviously means you also find stories of persecution, or you find the instances where people ended up in trouble with the law rather than other kinds of stories. So it kind of like already, um, yeah, orients the kind of thing that you will find.
When some of us learn this history, there's a narrative form that we are familiar with, whereby there's a sort of paradise lost in the Weimar period
Yeah.
that yields to its opposite kind of hellish Nazi period, which of course is not inaccurate. But one thing that I've taken from my reading of your work is that we should reconsider this completely two-sided periodization of Paradise Lost going into a Hell on Earth, that there's
Hmm.
continuity really in, you mentioned the police in the policing of these classifications from the Weimar period into the Third Reich.
Hmm.
How did you come to that understanding?
Honestly, I mean, it sounds cliche, but it really was just what the material was telling me.
Hmm.
Um, when I was getting immersed in the existing historiography and when I was thinking about doing this work, I myself held this assumption. I was like, okay, we understand, we like remember Weimar as this particular, like, sort of like you say, like a lost paradise for all kinds of queer people. And the history of transness there'd been a few articles, but not much had been written about, kind of followed a similar-ish trajectory. Um, and so I went in thinking that, and then every case file that I came across, and those case files were incredibly dense and rich. They weren't just a couple of pages, there were hundreds and hundreds of pages. All the stories didn't have a pattern. So they all ended up with different responses from the state, specifically the Nazi state. And this basically made me have to rethink this idea that, trans people had been given this relatively novel opportunity to transition in ways that hadn't been available historically before, and then that they were met with like uniform persecution in some kind of very clearly oppressive sense. And so I basically was like, I can't tell that story. That's not what the archive is telling me, and I'm kind of beholden to like good historical practice. And it made me have to kind of think about like, so what do I do with the fact that there's a trans category that exists and kind of thinking about the historical formation of categories, but that it doesn't explain that the state or society like fully understands it or fully wants to do clear-cut persecution with it. And that kind of led me to kind of thinking about like how do I explain that? And the way that I've ended up explaining it is calling it transliminality, which basically just means that transness did exist 100 years ago, but that it was a nascent early form of a category, and that there wasn't the same infrastructure either in like penal codes or societal expectations of like what it means to change one's gender, that there was no real uniform response to that. And in a way, it's also to say that um, quite frankly, like trans people were not of great social concern. We're seeing a very
Hmm.
different situation today. But at that point in history, that they simply didn't register on the same level of concern, whether that was in the Weimar period or whether that was in the Nazi period. And that doesn't mean that looking at trans people doesn't tell us something about the lived experiences of those people or like what it meant to be living in like Weimar and then Nazi Germany. And I often use these cases not only to tell a story about their lives and what it meant to be trans, but also to look at like, okay, so if the trans element of their identity didn't always register with the state, what did? And then I can use the cases together and kind of like reduce the trans aspect and kind of be like, so if this case ended up being, in a complicated way, a story of a trans woman who could do useful skilled labor for the state, ends up being given certain kinds of preferential treatment and tries to be reincorporated into the Volksgemeinschaft, which is like the idealized people's community in Nazi Germany. Why was that? Clearly, it has to do with like what kind of work she could do. So they really care about this kind of work. And if I contrast that with another case, which is also, a trans woman, but she's doing a different kind of work. So maybe she's doing sex work, and that case ends up at Mauthausen concentration camp, and she ends up dying there. Again, what's happening there is it's the labor, the specific kind of labor that is being penalized or being reified in some kind of way. And so a lot of the time, I'm kind of trying to also tell a story not just of like transness and trans people and like their relationship to the state and society, but also kind of trying to understand the logics, especially of the Nazi state more generally, and kind of trying to understand what they're prioritizing and what they are seeing as some kind of threat to the social order that they're establishing.
So one of the cases that I think you're alluding to is that of Garrett R., who's
Yes.
the
Yeah.
subject of your past and present article titled Transliminality.
Yeah.
And this is somebody who's got useful skills as well, if it's the right word, a draftsman.
Yeah.
and that this is something that really complicates the response to her from the authorities. So I'm just wondering how you came across this particular case, how it spoke to you, and how you came to decide to write an article about this one case.
Yeah. So as I like explained before, I was going into the archive in mainly in Berlin, the Landesarchiv, and I was like either going through name change applications or I was going through cases of penalization, either for paragraph 175, which is the anti-sodomy law, or these laws that were used against cross-dressing. But those laws, they basically penalize public nuisance. And so cases of public nuisance can kind of be anything. You know, you can think about people maybe inappropriately doing sexual things in public. Cross-dressing falls under that category. With this case, that was the penal code that I was sort of tracking. But the reason that Gerd R gets in trouble with the police is because she does something really bizarre and strange, which is she's caught by her neighbors going into the communal bins on the
Mm.
street naked at night, completely naked, and staying there overnight and then being found in the morning. And so like the neighbors would go and like they're gonna put their trash in the trash can and they open the lid and they're like, why is there this person that's like fully naked in here? This is really bizarre. I'm gonna call the police. Um, and that the fact that that was like the entry point into the source material made me go like, this is a strange. I want to learn more. Like I literally just want to read and like figure out what's going on. And that led me to sort of uncovering, I think, three or four different case files, including one that was from the Wittenau Asylum in Berlin, which is like a psychiatric institute. And so I was like finding all these different case files and trying to knit together this story. And the story is like a long and elaborate one, but it kind of tells at least from her perspective, like what it meant to be trans in the Weimar period and what it meant to be trans in the Nazi period, and that this expected narrative of sort of like you said, Paradise Lost met with total destruction just didn't map onto this story. And the
Mhm.
reason I wanted to write about it was because my experience of encountering it really prompted me to rethink that. And I was like, well, that's the perfect way of like actually addressing this expected narrative, where the short version of the story is she is one of the trans people that sort of socially and legally transitions. She changes her name. She lives as a woman. And so we think of this as like, wow, this is liberatory and progressive. But actually, because of doing these things, she loses her job. She receives loads of kinds of like social stigma at work. And her family kind of renounce and reject her, so she becomes homeless. And so this is actually a story of like socioeconomic downfall because she's transitioning. And when
Her
we
own
then,
partner turns on her at a certain point as well, right?
sorry, I say that again.
I'm sorry, her own partner turns on her at a certain point as well.
Right, exactly. And
Yeah.
in the Weimar period, she gets married. She has two children, and then when we shift into the Nazi period, it's it's kind of uneven and it's strange. But like you just said, her wife does turn on her, denounces her to the Gestapo. She ends up in Sachsenhausen in a very early part of the regime. I think it's like 1936. And then she's released like 8 or 9 months later. But she keeps doing this practice where she develops basically a sadomasochistic sexual ritual with her wife, where her wife would send her to the trash bin out in the street and tell her to get in it, and she would literally say, like, you are dirt, so I'm going to treat you like dirt. And what had been, an unusual, an idiosyncratic sexual practice that she had enjoyed with her wife, once her wife had denounced her and she lost that relationship, and she was also forced to stop living as a woman. She fell into a depressive state, would drink a lot, and would reenact this bin ritual on her own, which is an incredibly tragic manifestation of kind of like what that meant for her. But this is why the neighbors find her because she kind of repeatedly does this and she runs into trouble multiple different times. So even though because of doing this, she ends up in prison, she gets moved around a lot, and then she's released again. On her release, she doesn't this doesn't like change her behavior, so she keeps doing it. And eventually one of the court judges basically says like this behavior is not going to change, so I'm going to send you to a mental asylum, with sort of either hopes that this will rectify the situation, or this will just be a place that she can receive some kind of help. Um, and at this point, the story gets really interesting because both the manager for this mental asylum and her previous employer are basically very invested in the skill set that she has. Like she can do these really technical drawings. And I never actually found out like what they want her to be working on. But I'm assuming just at this point it's like 40, 41, that she, given that the war is on, that she can either do localized things like maybe infrastructural things, or that she's being tasked with something to do with the war. It's not entirely clear. But they start a sort of strange like tug of war over whether she should be inside or outside the asylum. And there's lawyers involved, there's money being thrown at the situation where her previous employer is like, I want you back. I want to be able to have your skill set. And the manager of the mental asylum is like, no, I want you here. I want you doing the work that I need to be done here. And so it's not that her transness is supported in any way, that would be the wrong conclusion, but it's almost like her transness becomes invisibilized and doesn't matter, and that she's not penalized for that,
Yeah.
but that she can um, therefore be seen as a producer of a certain kind of valued labor. So she gets reduced to the utility that she can provide. Um, and that when I came across all of this, I was like, hey, it's a crazy story. Like,
Yeah.
woman found in a trash can by neighbors is the reason that she's getting run-ins with the police. And B, that it tells you, pretty much start to finish, like what it meant to live in these two periods. And it's just felt like the perfect material to write an article about.
So you're doing this research that's very, very innovative, that is making us reconsider a lot of the received narratives that we've tried to use to make sense of this past. And so, as a scholar, that's one thing, but you're also an educator. And so, how is it in the classroom to try to orient students to this new way of seeing things?
Honestly, it's not been difficult.
Great.
I think that the students at Northwestern in particular are very sort of happy to take what you're saying and run with it, and they're very, very engaged and they're very curious. And there has actually been not a shift, because I can't track that it's been a shift, but there's been a change in, I think, how the students of today engage with topics to do with gender and sexuality. Maybe about in the last 5 to 10 years, a typical thing would happen. And I experienced this when I was an undergrad as well. I shared this disposition. So it's, I'm saying it with like lightness and care. But there was a kind of sense that if you had a lived experience that meant that you particularly understood sex gender systems, that you would come into the classroom and you would be like, I know what this is about. Like, I don't need to be educated whatsoever. And that there was a kind of a sense of like the experience of being someone who is gay, or who is queer, or who is trans is something that sort of like is transhistorical and will be kind of projected back into the past.
Right.
That hasn't actually been my experience teaching at Northwestern. A lot of the students that are coming in the classroom are coming in because they have a personal relationship to this kind of material. There are also students that have absolutely no personal reason to be there and are simply just interested and intrigued, which I think is great. And they're coming in and they don't need to overcome their own sense of knowledge. And they're really, really just taking the information and going, okay, well, that actually makes sense to me. Like one of the first conversations that I think most educators of gender and sexuality have to have is kind of being like, well, we live in a world where identity categories are pretty solid and sort of like thought through, and people's sex, sexuality, and gender are separable qualities. And one of the things that us historians do of these different topics is go like different times and places, those things are not as evenly discreetly separated out from each other. And so a lot of the time I have to be like, okay, so they don't necessarily have the same idea of like being gay or being trans in the past. And we'll go through the material together and they're just like, huh, yeah, this makes sense. Actually, it's less about a sort of like atomized identity that you have, and then that has a relationship to the world, and more that these identities are sort of fundamentally social from the outset,
Mhm.
um, and have a different relationship to the social whole. And they've just been able to digest that incredibly easily. I'm not sure what happened in the last 5 years for that to happen, but it's been the experience. So it's been great.
I am very heartened to hear this. I think that you're doing great things with our students already, and I look forward to many more conversations like this in years to come. Xavier, thank you for being here with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Robin.